Do you truly wish to make this deal with me? I stared at him, knowing he didn't comprehend the gravity of the situation, and could not resist adding, "You're welcome to leave if you wish." I felt at home here. The dimly lit restaurant was filled with distant, idle chatter between patrons, each table within eyeshot, but far enough to keep things discreet. The clientele demanded it. Besides, it would be unwise for the mortals to know what was happening around them. Each table decorated with tea candles floating in water at the center, with large, massive pillar candles surrounding the walls, and massive candelabras hung from the ceiling. A few finely dressed waiters walked between each table, with a serving tray carried on the tips of their fingers, stocked with a plate of food or with wine, their expressions neutral, and offered little in conversation. We were sat in the left-hand side corner, my back to the wall so I could see the comings and goings, while he had his back to the restaurant. This had been my favorite spot for generations long before his birth. My hands held the menu, pretending to read it, when I knew exactly what I planned to order and feast on. My calm and steady body movements, each gesture was smooth, while I noticed his were twitchy, rapid, filled with nerves. A few droplets of perspiration on his forehead that he wiped away. Clearly, he didn't believe he belonged here. The candles flickered between us, an untouched plate of food on his side, with a glass of wine on the other. He blushed, avoiding looking at me, and his hands fidgeted slightly. Watching him, I knew my victory was practically sealed. My lips painted red, with eyes lined with kohl to highlight them, gazed over the table. My hair matched my lips, and garbed in a black evening gown, clinging to every curve. I made quite the picture. By contrast, his sleepless nights had taken a toll on him, with the dark circles under his eyes. Yet, he did his best to dress for the occasion. Perhaps it was unkind of me to torture him beforehand.
Yes?
He answered, confused, yet doubting what he was experiencing was real. Very well. I do not take men at their word, and thus, I opened the palm of my hand, revealing a piece of parchment with a hidden freckle suggesting the unholy origin, an imperfect canvas for a deal to be made, and placed it, curled up beside me on the table. Then I reached across it, palm up, offering to take mine in his. The tender gesture often drew them in. He accepted with a dreamy smile, believing it to be romantic in nature. And once it was placed in mine, I brought it to my lips to place a deadly kiss on it, marking him as mine. It burned his skin, and he attempted to pull his hand away from the pain, turning it so he could see the brand. Before he could question it, I squeezed my clawed fingernail into his flesh, then pierced and sliced into his palm. It caused blood to trickle from the wound, running down his wrist, and for a moment, I doubted he realized how deep it ran.
What? What are you doing?
The alarm voice came as he winced in shock. A bemused giggle responded. Time to sign your life away. A black feathered quill appeared in the blink of an eye in my hand, before being offered to him, and the scroll unfurled. There was writing written in black ink of a lost and unknown language, one he couldn't understand. Rows of lettering with a line at the bottom reserved for his signature. I released his hand, bringing it to my lips, and slowly licking then sucking the blood off my thumb. his unblemished hand pressed tight on it to slow the bleeding, only to find my venom, a hemotoxin, used to prevent platelets from doing their job, caused the blood to flow freely. Now, deep down, he knew death was calling him. He cast a panic-stricken glance to the other patrons, desperate for someone to assist him.
Help!
He called out, reaching out to a waiter, who promptly wrinkled their top lip in distaste, and sidestepped to avoid being touched, and returned to his routine. Finding no assistance here, he turned to another and received similar treatment.
Can't you help me? Please!
He whispered hoarsely, before realizing there was no assistance to be had. Uncovering the wound, he saw it was still bleeding, with no sign of it stopping. You'd best get that sorted soon, or else you're going to bleed out. I toasted with a wine glass, my elegant fingers delicately holding the base of it, before I brought it up to painted lips and swallowed the liquid in slow, steady mouthfuls. He picked up the black quill, realizing it was made of bone, and stared at me. The sauce was not so humanely farmed. I gave him an amused smile, and seemingly was unconcerned for his fate. Realizing that if he wanted to live, he had to make a choice. Dipping the tip into his blood, he signed the first part of his name, only to run out of the crimson ink, and he had to take more, suddenly hurrying and piercing himself in the process. With a jump, he scribbled quickly, handwriting now barely recognizable. His body swayed, vision blurring, and for the briefest of moments, he saw my true form. 2 horns sprung from my skull, sharp teeth, large bat-like wings sprouted from my sides, and my cat-like eyes glowed over the candlelight that bored deep into his soul. I saw my reflection in his eyes, a horned creature from a nightmare, or a perverse taste. With a blink, the curated image had returned, and he finished his signature, only to find that he was still bleeding.
What? You promised that you'd stop the bleeding if I signed!
He exclaimed, tightly pressing his hand, and already it coated the previously white tablecloth. His white dress shirt clung to his stomach with blood, and the realization sank in that he was dying. He coughed, staring at his pale hands that had a touch of blue to them. Blinking slowly, he rested his head on the surface of the table, his heartbeat fading. His eyes finally closed, and he drew his final breath. I finished the remnants of my wine and placed the glass on the table, when a lanky, silver-haired, well-dressed waiter stood by my side.
I hope you're satisfied, madam. I will ensure he is brought to your room completely intact.
His heavily wrinkled lips curled upwards in a pleasing smile. A quick, ravenous lick of his lips and watering of his mouth warned me of his possible intention. You'd best not take a nibble like last time, Frederick, I cautioned dryly.
Of course, madam.
He bowed deeply, formally, and yet stood politely beside me in a not-so-subtle reminder. Alas, how could I forget a tip? Letting out a slow exhale, the only sign of a slight indication of irritation, and knew what he desired. I opened my handbag, reached inside, and took out a still-beating heart, then placed it in his white-gloved hand.
Thank you, madam.
He accepted it hungrily, placing it gently on the platter, and left carrying the body in tow. Frederick had kept his word. The corpse of... what was his name again? Checking the parchment to see what it was. Stephen Lancaster. No one I would have chosen for him. His corpse lay on the king-size bed. The sheets alabaster with a pink outline around him, drained of blood and without clothing. The faint aroma of an early death clung to him. A hint of disinfectant, and bare traces of blood. I could sense the other actions occurring in the other rooms. Some intimate, some being feasted on, while others were enduring them both. Mentally, I shut the imagery out, focusing on my own prey. It was time, and I couldn't waste more. I disrobed, allowing the ebony silk robe to fall to the ground, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My hands trailed over my body, no longer recognizing the mortal form I use regularly. In human form, the illusion of fertile beauty, with my red hair loose around my shoulders. I wondered when my form would alter, and thus far, this one had proven to be a favorite. A circle of 7 black pillar candles around the bed were lit up with a single strike of a match. Without the training from my elders, I was unable to bring him back without aid, and thus required the ritual. Once they were all in place, closing my eyes to focus, summoning the powers of my kind, and allowed the illusion I had created to fall away. Stepping on the bed, I easily straddled his corpse and rested my hand on his face, studying his facial features. The dead always looked more youthful, the stress of life now gone. A short clipped beard, amber-colored eyes, a slightly crooked bottom jaw, and short black curls framing his face. Remembering the conversations they had, where he'd mentioned his many conquests, some true whilst others were pure fantasy. How eager he was to be lured by me, how willing he was to throw aside it all. Using the warmth of my body, I leaned down to press my breast against his chest. His flesh was still warm, and gazing at his face, my clawed fingertips pried open his dead eyes, staring intently into his, and began to will him back to life. Imagining breath in his lungs and his heart beating. Having not been dead long, it should be easy. A soft, dread whispering from my lips, in a language from before humanity walked the earth, a time when gods roamed and fell. His left hand by his side twitched, the spark of life coursing through his veins, and the whispering grew louder, urging him onward. His right trembled, and his chest jerked upwards. His feet shook, and a deep, guttural moan came from the base of his throat. Shadows circled around the room, growing darker, and candles kept flickering intently, their flames tall and dancing vigorously. His eyes shot open, and a deep, intense breath. He rose down below and entered inside me. The shock of life renewed on his lips. My hands rested on his chest, and my hips moved in a slow, steady rhythm. His seed would bring him back to life. It was working, his body reacting, being brought back from death and a new form of life. With a long, gasping moan, he reached his peak with a sharp jolt of his hip, before releasing his seed. I let out a smug smirk of victory. The pact was now complete. The candles all snuffed out at the same time, sending trails of smoke up into the air. He choked, before coughing deeply, veins showing in his bright red face as the agony of life returned to him. I lifted my body up. Stephen rolled to his side, coughing and vomiting up a thick, black, sticky gel in heavy clumps.
What happened? What did you do to me?
Stephen's rasping voice blurted out, staring up at me, and was greeted with a cool, methodical stare in response. I brought you back. Death does not negate the contract, I answered, my smirk revealing a fang. And besides, how better to begin your new life? I practically bared my teeth.
Cancel it.
His words fumbled.
I died. I remember bleeding out. I can't be back here.
Wincing, teeth taut together, his hands clutched his head to keep the memories at bay. Stephen lurched forward, head in his hands and groaning deeply, his teeth now chattering, trying to bring feeling back to his fingertips. The memories of his old life flooded back, and yet they no longer felt like they were his. His muscles ached. Suddenly a feeling of freezing uncertainty washed over him. The dead were rarely grateful to be brought back, especially when they were now under the yoke of eternal servitude. My hand took a chair, used for amorous, watchful purposes, and pulled it over with a gentle creaking sound. Sitting down on it, completely at ease in my nudity, my right leg crossed over my left and leaned on an elbow on the left-hand side. Stephen was still rasping, hanging off the foot of the bed, and wrapped his arms around himself, shivering. Poor dear, unable to understand the bargain he had made.
Why am I here?
He panicked, casting me a quick glance and darting his eyes around, still unable to look at me. A rising anger filled his veins, and brief images of him hurting me filled his mind. Not so discreetly. Stephen's focus rested on the door, and then sharply looked away. I knew he desired to escape. I've told you. What else do you need to know? I answered softly. A clawed finger moved to the direction of the door. It unlocked and creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway with faint sounds of someone crying softly in the distance. Or, perhaps, leave, if you wish. Yet understand, there are worse things out there than me. Unwilling to let this chance bypass him, he wrapped the sheet around his waist and ran outside, then down the hallway, only to hear my long, taunting laugh follow him. The door slammed and locked behind him. He rushed through what seemed like an endless hallway with countless doors. None had numbers on them, nor any sign of the occupants inside. A strange scurrying sound came from one, while a deep moan from another, and he didn't wait to see the cause.
Help! Help! I've been kidnapped!
He cried out, hoping someone would find him. Yet only after he did so, he regretted it, yet kept going, bare feet running on Persian carpets. The movement caused the pattern to become a slithering snake as he ran. The green capital letters with exit caused a burst of hope to course through his veins. A sharp, blood-curdling scream could be heard, causing him to stop in his tracks. He stared at the door, hearing someone smacking on it and screaming to get out. It grew louder before a long, mournful cry was emitted. A hand touched the doorknob, rattling it, and it was enough to drive him away. Running back the way he had come, imagining what horror lurked behind that door and all the others, until he found the one he had fled from.
Come on. I need to get out of here.
He thought to himself before going to another door. He smacked his hands on it, screaming and trying to open the door. When the door beside it opened, a woman, garbed in a filthy white gown, stared at him. A tainted wedding dress, with a too wide smile on her face and a hungry look in her eye. An elongated arm reached out, grasped his wrist, and turned it to see the burn kiss mark, my brand. Figuring he had already endured enough, I decided to grant him a small mercy. The correct door opened. Unburdened by clothing, I stood, locking eyes with the feminine creature, drawing myself up, staring her down, and a low growl emitted, marking my territory. With surprising strength, I grabbed him and pushed him back inside the room, causing him to fall, still disorientated, onto the floor.
What the hell was that? Who was she?
He demanded hoarsely, our nightmarish images still vivid in his mind.
What the hell is this place?
Now you've gotten that out of your system. I taunted him and gazed down at him, top lip curled in contempt. A foot rested on his chest, holding him down to keep him in place. Stephen tried to rise, yet found he was powerless. It lifted slightly and moved to rest on his neck, squeezing down, causing him to choke. His hands wrapped around my ankle, pushing up, and a flash of unexpected fear in his eyes when he realized I was far stronger than any mortal woman. With a grunt, he let go, allowing his hands to fall in grudging submission. Remember, you could have chosen death than exist like this. Deep down, he knew I was correct. At first he glared up at me, a tear of frustration in his eyes, and then fell away to reveal his shame.
I thought your kind slowly drained men.
Yes, I lifted my foot from him and strode toward the wooden vanity. Its curved legs and deep table were bare, all except for a single ornate hairbrush. 3 mirrors, with a larger one flanked by 2 smaller ones. Taking a seat on the velvet-lined stool and picking up the brush, I began to run it through my hair. This, a normal event for me, while earth-shattering for him. My mirror reflection gazed back at him, making eye contact, and the illusion twisted. Suddenly my features were not quite right. Ones that were once beautiful became altered. Before shifting back to the appearance, I used the first lure him in. I do, yet your purpose is different.
What? What do you want me to do?
He stared up at me, his bordering on fearful and hostile. I gave a knowing smirk. There was no way for him to understand. Not yet, anyway. Think of yourself as my thrall, servant, follower, attendant, my devoted, whichever you prefer and can take peace in. You may even find you enjoy being in this position.
No. I never agreed to this.
Oh, you certainly did. My hand elegantly opened, fingers unveiled with the infamous scroll curled up, only for it to unfurl before him and revealed his signature. And, gods above and below, he stared at it with furious hunger in his eyes. Not that he could act on any of these emotions plaguing him. Tossing it in the air, it disappeared into a puff of smoke, to where he, and his kind, would never be able to tread. Once satisfied with my appearance, I stood and walked into the ensuite. It was large, lined with expensive marble, and I made my way to the shower. Upon entering, I knew he'd hear the sound of water striking tiles, and soon the water cascaded over my naked body. The warmth of the hot water and the aroma of it filled my nostrils. Mentally, I tried luring him in with imagery and received an animalistic whimper in response. His mind still human. His sensations were more intense. He sat head in his hands, the situation finally sinking in, and it was sooner than I expected. Death. He wanted to die. He strode to the curtain, drawing it backward to find there were bars to prevent falls. Not rare in hotels, and he pushed on them, struggling to escape. The bars refused to yield. "You may want to come in," I called out from the shower, smiling, knowing his desire to escape, yet after the incident earlier, I doubted he'd try that again. Closing his eyes, he rested his forehead on the window panel and exhaled. He entered the bathroom, and patiently, I'd been waiting for his arrival. Leaning on the wall, with water dribbling down every curve of my body, glowing eyes stared through the condensation and beckoned him closer. Stephen dropped the sheet to the floor, and taking my hand before I pulled him close, wrapped my legs around him. The feel of my skin against his mortal one, our lips connecting and caressing each other. He lost his shyness. Lips broke away to explore the contours of my body. The contact brought back more memories of what had occurred. He saw one man being drained, his eyes wide and his body withered, then lingered on the brink of death until he finally ceased to be. There were others, from countless cultures and time periods, leading all the way back to my dreadful birth. Over the course of several hours, we reached our climax multiple times in a mess of flesh meeting flesh. In smoke and water, surrounded by the elements, his body started to morph as humanity drained from his living, undead flesh. This time felt different. I could feel the change in him. After the cleansing, I left him to his thoughts and dried myself in the next room, keeping a mental eye on what he was doing. He stared in the mirror, still looking yet no longer feeling like himself, and intently stared at his reflection, holding his eyelids open and noticing his pupils were larger, with little space between them and the iris. It too had expanded out into the sclera. Soon, there'll be no more difference to his eyes. His grey eyes would soon be no more. Turning his head from side to side, examining his features, barely recognizing them, and entered the walk-in closet to pick up the only clothing available to him, all in his size. Now dressed in a pair of black dress shoes, a white dress shirt, and black slacks, soon the pair walked down the hallway, and he, just a step behind me. And despite his attempts, he couldn't walk out of pace. Stephen could hear faint whispering from the rooms, and a swirl of voices surrounded him. He stared out the window at a group of people, wanting to be like them again, completely devoted to their lives, without realizing the supernatural danger that lurked around them. I had somewhere I needed to be, and reaching the mostly deserted lobby, freshly cleaned with no signs of life, we approached a large office with double doors and otherwise unmarked. I stood at the door, waiting to see if he'd take the hint, glancing out the door and then at him, a silent command. I could feel him fight me now, not wishing to be a servant. The idea of servitude clashed with his ideals of freedom, and after receiving a pulsing, intense headache, He opened the door and was released from the pain. Much better. You'll learn.
I'll escape when I have the chance.
I heard his thoughts scream out to me from the void. Now looking inside, he noticed it was harsh to the eye, stark white and black. The furniture in isometric spiked shapes, a place where humans would not find comfort. While the room appeared to be empty, he seemed to sense the presence inside. "Stay," I told him, then entered the room. The door closed behind me. I could sense his movement and focus on addressing the manager of this establishment. Technically, we were all nestled inside him, since the building itself was, well, him. And this was the sole place we could communicate. A garbled voice spoke. I nodded my head in understanding. "Apologies. It won't happen again. He's still being broken in. The adjustment period." It became more hostile, and the threats increasingly demanding. The low growl warned me of both our fates should it continue. Expectant and irritating to listen to. I sensed where Stephen was, just in case he tried to slip away yet again. He stood patiently by the left-hand side of the door, his back resting against the wall, and gazed out into the hallway, oblivious to the meeting taking place. Then a woman, a ghoul, walking past, using shadows to deceive him, and took his hand in hers, pinning him against the wall and whispering in a low voice, her bottom jaw opening wide. As he widened his eyes, attempting to push her off, and his shades dropped and revealed his eyes to hers, she drew backward, releasing him, and left, walking down the hallway, muttering under her breath. I was surprised when I felt him. He wanted to reach out to me, hoping I would answer him, though I knew it was solely out of fear, perhaps to distract or to torment him. I sent him images of the various encounters we'd been doing over the past couple of months. Not that he realized how much time had passed, torturing him, toying with him, and suddenly leaving him alone to his thoughts. He wasn't privy to the conversation taking place inside the room. He waited for an unknown amount of time. Again, memories that did not belong to him entered his mind. Some amorous, and most, if not all, ending in death. He saw a newspaper from the 1950s before it faded into nothingness. Now done, the manager's warning given. The door opened by itself, and I stepped through, agitated and unable to do anything about it. It then slammed, striking the wall. A feral look in my eye, and my lips a taut line. His brief, polite look offered questions he didn't want the answer to, and without a command required, he followed in line behind me. Always one step behind. This place had been my home away from home for the better part of 100 years. As we walked, he glanced inside one of the rooms to see a girl on her back, still breathing, and choking, with her ribs brutally cracked open, and an otherwise wholesome family scooping out her organs before feasting on their bloody handfuls. Their hands were naturally coated in blood and gore, spilling over the desk and their hands and clothing. Her breathing was becoming fainter now, and he most certainly could tell she still lived, even if humans could not. "It is best you look. Take it all in. You're part of this world now."
Why do you need me around?
The demand snapped. I questioned, raising a brow of interest.
Why do you need me here? Clearly you...
His hand moved to debate the best possible term.
You can hunt alone. You don't need me to do it for you.
I regarded him patiently, before lifted my shoulders in a gentle shrug, and I didn't desire to share any answers. You will find you have many uses for me. With the dawn of a fresh hunt approaching, my appearance changed yet again. The prey had long been in mind. This time, my body morphed to a shorter woman. Black hair cast down my back, with bangs framing my face. My eyes became a rich brown, framed by thick, luscious eyelashes. My skin was warm and rich, and my curves became even fuller. Still lovely, beautiful in the eye of the beholder, and I gazed over my shoulder at him. My next victim, a businessman who gained his wealth through exploitative means, filming and then blackmailing girls who had flown over from another country. He made up for his lack of charm and ability by flashing money in the eyes of lower-income women, ones on the verge of homelessness, all in the hopes of finding money and security. I waited across the way at the same table we had been at, back when Stephen was mortal, and he felt mocked. I could tell by his frequent exhales and fidgeting. No longer could he keep count on the number. None of their faces were distinct anymore. You'll see, I told him. Show rather than tell.
That happened to me.
The realization set in that his experience was not the only one. Humans often center themselves and have trouble seeing beyond them. And yet, he retained this trait.
How many has this happened to?
I had lost count, their faces and stories lost to me. Not answering him, I rose to greet my latest victim with a friendly smile, leaving Stephen standing there and taking in his new world. I felt his heart rate spike, a jump, when he likely saw the shadows, both of the dual hunters and the hunted. I knew he wanted to warn him. Good evening. I apologize for keeping you waiting. I placed a tender kiss on my latest cheek, making a long stare at Stephen. Stephen placed his hand on the other man's shoulder, wishing to convey urgency. Humans, with their silly notions of preserving others.
Excuse me, please, you need to get...
He insisted, then was suddenly able to see what kind of man he was. A blink, and he was able to view his soul, the depths, and saw the struggles he had placed mortal women in, using them for money with promises of love and affection, only to leave them broken, blackmailed. Flashes of women with bruised faces, forever locked in debt that could never be paid until they are finally discarded. Perhaps I may have chosen ones that would pull on the old heartstrings, all for my own benefit. A brief, cautionary glance from me told him he was being foolish.
Pardon, I mistook you for someone else.
He removed his hand, embarrassed, wiping it on his trousers to remove the filth of touching him, and returned to his position by the wall, practically blending in with the environment. Turning my attention back to the task at hand, we dined, spoke, and he boasted about all he could offer me, all the promises of earthly riches that held no value over me.
He dropped something in your drink.
Stephen warned me, a look of alarm on his face. I know, I answered inside his mind. After several drinks and tedious conversation, my victim, his voice blurred, proposed to sleep with me. I reached out my hand, gently nicked him with my pinky nail, and connected us in a blood rite.
Ah, that's where it happens.
The moment consent is offered, the man's body fell limp, my venom working quickly as it did so. a low moan coming from his lips, and he was incapacitated.
Did you kill him?
Pick him up, I commanded, and once lifted, holding him in his arms, we made our way back to my room. I could hear the faintest heartbeat and the lingering sounds of his breathing. This time, instinct taught him which was the correct one, and a neutral look lingered on Stephen's face. The stunned man was placed on the bed, in the same position, and I drew him in. The amorous session was long, and his seed kept releasing until it hurt, and there was finally no more. With every roll of my hips, my flesh tightened around him, and without his seed, it now drained his life essence. His face sank in, leaving nothing but a withered husk, a skeleton that barely resembled the man he'd once been. Life leaving his body. The final breath, the most delicious part, and I drew it in. The final remnants of Stephen Solera now had become black, the final nail in the coffin. There was a change in him now. The sight of blood and suffering no longer fazed him in the same way. Watching him sit in the same seat I had taunted him previously, curious, expressionless, and I wondered whether he'd develop an appetite for it. Take him out into the alley.
But what if the cops find him?
You needn't worry. I gave him a dismissive wave of my hand, turning away. I watched through my eyes as he rolled the carcass up in a sheet, made his way unburdened and bothered along the hallway, the other supernatural creatures giving him a wide berth. The large wooden doors opened. It was cool with a breeze from nighttime. Not that he needed to concern himself about that anymore. Two of the butlers stood by the doorway, smoking, and otherwise ignored him. Their faces grey, with sores of the dead lingering on them. One pointed his pinky finger, whilst holding a cigarette, to the alleyway to give him direction. He walked out, and threw the body into the alley, only for many arms to reach up, grasping and pulling on it, tearing the body apart, and the sound of feasting could be heard. He watched them removing evidence from the world, and thought of all those missing people, the countless number who had become food for the many beings of the world. Under the flickering light of a street sign, he stood, then silently turned on his heel to walk back inside. He had no cause of alarm anymore.
It is done.
No protest. Nothing. We settled into what could be described as domestic life. He stripped the bed of bloodied sheets, silently removing the evidence, and threw them down the laundry chute. They echoed down, only to hear ravenous growling and tearing things up down below. He didn't even question it anymore. The greeting of the sun, my hands moved over my face, changing my appearance once again for my target. This time, it would be no villain, yet instead, a well-meaning man who would prove to be a challenge. Are you ready for the next? I asked, looking over my shoulder. Appearance changed back to my original form.
Yes, ma'am. I'm ready.
He agreed, adjusting his shades to conceal his eyes from mortals, ready to proceed with his new life. I hope you enjoy this story. What did you think of it? Let me know what you thought in the comments section down below. Don't forget to stab the like button, subscribe, hit the bell and leave a comment. This video is made with the support of my incredible channel members, Patreon subscribers and all my viewers. Thank you so much for supporting me. Don't forget to check out my social media accounts below, including my merch. Stay safe, my little spooklings. And remember, I'll be watching you.